The horror genre is probably one of the weirdest ones in media. It's never the most popular, but it goes through these cycles of pushing itself into the public consciousness and gaining some relevancy. But despite this, it still always remains a niche concept, not really making money for executives, and so it gets subjected to alterations to attempt to appeal to a larger audience, and thereby it becomes like a amorphous blob that no one really likes, and then it gets abandoned. But then the niche demand is back, and so the cycle recurs. And the gaming industry is no different. In fact, it's probably the example of this phenomenon. It is a frustrating cycle for fans of these games, and has led to the flooding of digital marketplaces with a cavalcade of knockoffs. But despite the mistreatment, it has always had its place within the culture. Especially since it's actually been responsible for the creation, or at least popularizing, of mechanics that other games would go on to make use of. Most notably Resident Evil 4's third-person camera view, which yes, it did not invent, but definitely gave mainstream attention to. And so we turn to horror's most well-known gaming form, survival horror, popularized by the Resident Evil series. Now we've reached the point where pretty much anyone involved within the culture can tell you that Resident Evil was actually inspired by an SNES game called Sweet Home. In fact, we've actually passed that point, and now come to the one where people will say, well, actually, while Sweet Home is set in a mansion and has monsters, it doesn't really have any hallmarks of survival horror gameplay, so really Alone in the Dark is actually the first survival horror game. This is so well known that I don't think I have to go through the entire rigmarole of that introduction. But while it is well known, I do question how many people have actually played it. So I have decided to take up the task. I got it all dark and atmospheric and played Alone in the Dark in 2023. Or, as I thought it was very funny to call it as a young English-speaking boy with a very rudimentary understanding of Afrikaans, Alleen in die Donker. And here are my findings. As per usual, we will be starting with how the game plays, which is not very well. I could probably just say it's old and clunky and call it a day, but come on, we're going to go into a bit more detail than that. Firstly, the movement. Of course, being the grandfather of the survival horror genre, we are subjected to the fun of tank controls. And if you found Jill and Chris frustrating to move around, then you best stay away here. Sir Eddington Carnelby has the turning circle of 3 trucks loaded on top of each other, and it really makes moving through doors, tight spaces and lining up for fighting really frustrating. The only other movement related matter is running, and for quite a while I didn't think it was actually possible to do so. But then I discovered it was more of a system issue than the game itself. In order to run, all you need to do is double tap forward. But the problem is with newer systems, they process the inputs too quickly, so the gap you have to press the second time and initiate running is extremely minute. Now there isn't any kind of stamina gauge, so you can just keep sprinting once you've started, but now the handling is even worse, and there's a pretty good chance you're going to hit a wall. But you do need to run, not only for certain parts of the games where it is necessary to do so, but also, why would you want to deprive yourself of this animation? Onto combat, and it's almost as painful as movement. You can find a fair number of weapons throughout the game, but generally they aren't going to provide too much of a respite since they are still victim to the core mechanics. You hold down spacebar to enter Jolly Ho Tickety Boo Pip Pip mode, and from there you use the directional buttons to select the type of attack you would like to carry out. Punches or kicks when you're unarmed, and if you have a bladed weapon, different directions of slashing. Yes, no thrusting. Now this actually sounds like a pretty impressive combat system for the time, learning the reach and speeds for the different attacks and assessing which is best for each enemy, and it does really seem like that at first, after initially having trouble and my first encounter being like this. I did eventually manage to give him a good biffing, and then I followed it up with evidently bashing his friend, which left me with the concern that the combat was actually going to be too easy. But the more I got into fights, the more I realized what a frustration it was going to become. The main issue is perspective. Because of the camera angles and the pretty poor depth perception in conjunction with the positioning controls I mentioned earlier, it can actually be quite hard to ensure you've lined yourself up properly and that you're actually close enough. And so you often end up missing, which either leaves you open to your enemy's attack or requires you to move closer, which will then leave you open to your enemy's attack. And once you're hit, it can be very difficult to recover. Every attack momentarily stun locks, and the time it takes to recover and then wind up to attack usually leaves you open to be attacked again, so we generally get subjected to this. And then when you die, you get a prolonged death cutscene which ends with the evil spirit doing some kind of Skeletor pose. So having mentioned the combat, and the various means in which you can partake in it, one might think it's a very combat intensive game. But that's actually not really the case. Alone in the Dark is a pretty weird mishmash of genres. Like, it's got some of the elements that would be associated with survival horror today, but it also plays a bit like a point and click adventure. And then later, in the absolute worst part of the game, it becomes a platformer for a bit. An extremely painful bit, in which the depth perception and camera angles create what should be like 3 minutes of platforming top, but then it makes it a tedious exercise that takes twice as long. It's so broken that even the game itself doesn't understand what's going on at times. But fortunately, it is a small part of the game, so let's examine the two predominant genres mixed in here. Two that I would actually say are kind of interlinked in a weird way, the first one being It may come across as a bit of a weird comment to say that it relates to this genre when I've literally just described how you move around with tank controls, but it does link to it in the other core aspect of gameplay. The key thing that survival horror and point and click have in common is the use of puzzles as one of the core gameplay loops. Well, it's kind of the only aspect for point and click, while survival horror uses it as the interlude between the combat, but I would say that Alone in the Dark veers more to the former, not just due to the fact that it's probably more puzzle based than combat based, but also because of how you engage with the puzzles. Firstly, you need to be in the creative mode to commit the necessary actions. If you want to fight, you need to be in fight mode. If you want to jump, you need to be in jump mode. And if you want to go around groping mid-air, you have to put yourself in search mode. When in search mode, you can rummage through various containers and obtain items from them, as well as those you can just pick up from lying around. And then the point and click nature of the game truly comes out. You pick up so many random items and you just need to figure out what to do with them. And it's not like in Resident Evil where you can examine the items or select your object of interest and then select another appropriate item, in which you can get a bit of a help determining what kind of item would fit in here, which one you could use. Instead, you just scroll through your inventory and determine whether the item is applicable to things which you actually aren't even 100% sure what they actually are. And on that note, let's discuss the quality of the puzzles. They're quite a mixed bag. The first plot-reliant puzzle requires you to get past 2 gargoyles if you want to get downstairs, and in order to do so, you need to place these 2 mirrors into the statues alongside them. This isn't immediately obvious, but you're able to make this deduction based off of the limited items you have. Then later, you have to fight this pirate, and he dodges all your attacks with other weapons, and you have to fight him with a sword. Now, there's nothing strictly wrong with this, and if you're finding yourself unable to hit your opponent, you'll probably just end up trying the sword out in your inventory. The only problem with this is the part of having the sword in your inventory. You don't find the sword lying around while exploring. You need to defeat this armored knight here, but you don't know you can, since he seems to be impervious to damage. So you generally just try and avoid it, especially since there are actually enemies that can't be defeated, so that's the assumption you make. And in order to defeat it, you have to pick up this heavy statue and then throw it at the knight. Now, I don't know about you, but this is not a solution that jumped out to me initially. Similarly, the final boss requires you to place a talisman, which you picked up ages ago, on the altar in front of it, and then you have to throw your lamp at it. Now, throwing the lamp does make sense in retrospect. it's a tree, and trees do burn good, but again, it just comes across as a bit unintuitive. In a horror game, your light source is always one of your closest allies, so throwing it away doesn't come very naturally, especially in a game called Alone in the Dark. It also just seems a bit unceremonious as a way to defeat the final boss. Like, imagine the Gohan vs Cell fight from Dragon Ball Z. Instead of Gohan going like Super Saiyan 2 and powering up, linking with his father to defeat Cell, he just chucks a lamp at him. But let's move on to the other dominant genre. Gosh Horror, the game that pioneered the genre, has a lot of features of the genre. But of course, being the pioneer, it isn't exactly how we know them today. So let's check how it portrays some of these more well-known aspects of it. This aspect is pretty much hitting the right notes. The game revolves around visiting a limited number of rooms, taking note of the interactable objects, and picking up all the items to be found. And then returning to the other rooms to see if any of the items you have obtained can be used. The rooms are also interlinked, and you can unlock doors to open up shortcuts to the various rooms. However, there is a problem with this aspect. You don't unlock the doors by just unlocking them from the other side, apart from 1 or 2, or by removing obstructions as with Resident Evil or Silent Hill. Instead, you have to find the keys to unlock the doors, which yes, of course also features in Silent Hill and Resident Evil, but in those two, the key is either labelled, or you can just interact with the door and unlock it. Here you have to select the key, and then wonder if it maybe unlocks the door, and then feel up the door to see if it actually opens. But it is a small niggle, which doesn't really detract from the fact that the aspect is actually done well. I noted that the fights can easily go wrong, but importantly, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. In survival horror, combat is supposed to be a risk calculation. Every combat encounter involves a consideration of whether it's actually worth fighting or just running away. Of course though, this does require you to be actually able to run away from the encounter. In Resident Evil, for example, pretty much every non-boss encounter is avoidable. Even the extremely fast enemies like the Hunters and the Crimson Heads are avoidable if you are dexterous enough and have a good knowledge of the nearest exits and shortest paths across the rooms. To say that combat encounters are unavoidable in Alone in the Dark, it's not strictly true, but they are definitely a lot harder to avoid. Firstly, the controls do just make it that much more difficult, obviously. But most notably, the encounters are done in a jump scary, heavy air quotes there, kind of way, where usually you get trapped in the room and you can attempt to avoid, but you're very much constrained by the controls and the very limited area of space you have to move. Though on that note, this is actually where some pretty cool puzzles come in. They don't actually need to be solved, but they can help you out in these situations. For example, in the first room of the game, if you take too long, a creature jumps into the window, and relatively shortly afterwards, a zombie comes out from a trap door. But if you're quick enough, you can push the nearby cabinet in front of the window, and you can push a chest over the trapdoor to prevent them from coming in. Likewise, later there's a room full of zombies that you could avoid fighting if you just take a pot from the kitchen and place it on the table. Not combat related, but similarly, there was a room filled with an ashtray that billows smoke in a radius at increasing and decreasing pattern. You can get a jug and fill it with water to put the fire out, or you can just time your movements to avoid the smoke. And this is genuinely an interesting aspect, being rewarded for being observant and figuring things out. The last thing I want to say on combat encounters is the variety of the creatures that you do encounter. As good as Resident Evil 7 was, the really disappointing aspect was apart from the members of the Baker family, you only took on Venom from Spider-Man 3. Kind of weird since the first game had the zombies, dogs, sharks, spiders, and a villain from Scooby-Doo. Alien in the Donker has zombies, this thing, ghosts, the disattached Michelin Man. Did you know this game won an award for the best graphics of 1993? A giant worm, spiders, bats, I think, and a Scooby-Doo villain. It's not vitally important, but it's just nice to have that variety. Let's go now on to discuss the last major survival horror aspect. The inventory management in Solo en la Oscuridad is really bad, mostly because for a fair chunk of the game, you don't even know that it exists. You just pick up items unfettered, and eventually you get told you don't have any more space to carry stuff. But then, you can't even use this as the point of maximum occupancy from which you know you can't carry any more, since the objects have different weights. I mean, it makes sense that a heavy statue takes up more space than a book, but you're not told by how much. This is then compounded by the fact that you also are left with a lot of useless tat. You can find first aid kits which contain flasks. You can then drink from the flask in order to increase your health. I didn't realize Edward can't be the Dark Souls character, but now you are left with an empty box and an empty flask, which has absolutely no use. So why not just automatically discard it off the use? And then the final point of irritation, just to nail this home, is there's no item box or option to just discard. So instead you have to throw junk around the mansion, which will then cross over and be prompted to pick it up again. No wonder this ghost got so annoyed with me. I just walked into a room and started chucking shit all around. So that's the gameplay aspects of the survival horror examined. Let's take a look at the other core aspect of this genre. Sorry if this comes across as gatekeeping, but you kind of need a game to be scary and unsettling if you want to call it horror. I'm not going to claim to know what makes something scary. I realize that everyone has a different threshold, and there are also different kinds which hit people differently, whether it's psychological horror, body horror, or your more jump scary and gore based horror. But I do think there is a bit of a checklist you can go through to help you get it right. It's always nice to have a good and interesting plot in any game, but I would argue it's particularly more important in horror games, especially compared to shooters, platformers, or action games for example. And I believe the reason for this is that they follow a similar vein to the mystery genre, in terms of working with the unknown and limited information. They also rely heavily on immersion for their full effect, and that can be ruined when the plot has clear holes or doesn't make sense. It doesn't need to be extremely complex or mad thought-provoking, just a solid plot. So, let's take a look at the plot of Cell d'un Le Noir. Edward Carnby is a private investigator who is asked to enter the Deseto mansion in order to find a piano that an antique dealer is interested in. The house has been abandoned since the previous owner hanged himself in the attic, and I suppose since it's the 1920s it's just fair game now, I guess. Once in the attic, the scarily darily start coming out, and we must make our way downstairs. When attempting to open the main entrance, a giant worm goes nom 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 on you. Now let me quickly stop the synopsis to point out this is actually a good decision. It may seem like a minor thing, but it's very important that the character has a reason to be where they are. It's very draining on the immersion if you see a person suffering and at severe risk, but then you can just be like, dude, just leave. So a very small and easy thing to do, but there needs to be some reason for not being able to just leave. Anyway, in attempting to find a way out, we discover that the house was built by a fellow by the name of Ezekiel Pregest, who involved himself with dark rituals beneath the manor, which he conducted to prolong his life and increase his fortunes. He was eventually shot, but his spirit remained within the house and possessed the previous owner, Jeremy Hartwood, and he used him to continue the rituals, which is why he eventually killed himself. The spirit is now seeking to possess Adams for its purposes, so obviously we now need to defeat the spirit if we wish to leave the property. So it's a pretty standard fare, generic, and by now pretty cliche plot, but it is solid. The use of the occult is a pretty good one for horror, since it allows an explanation for some of the more weird elements. Why is there a giant worm outside? Occult rituals. Why are there ghostly orbs going doodly-doo? Occult rituals. So, the basic plot sets a good basis for horror. Let us now look at the means to which this plot is conveyed. The game actually does the exposition very well, in that there is very little of it. The only dedicated moment of actual exposition is right at the beginning, when it explains to us why we're in the mansion in the first place. Otherwise, nothing else is explicitly told, and anything else will have to be found from reading notes and books that can be found. If you are not observant enough, you will miss these books, and you won't get all the information. But importantly, this won't severely impact your movement throughout the game. The immediate plot is simple enough that you don't need so much detail to navigate yourself. And to an extent, being unaware of the machinations creating the supernatural adds to the mystery and ethereal nature, and so the spookiness. And when you do indulge in the additional exposition, it's a mixed experience. Let's start with the positive aspect. The game is inspired by the writing of H.P. Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe. I haven't really read Lovecraft, but I have read the works of Edgar Allan Poe, and they are very effective at creating a feeling of unease and a frightening chill, not just in terms of the content, but the way they are written. And Manostos Kostadi recreates this writing very well, astutely adding to the atmosphere, but there is unfortunately a negative.
Following a splendid journey, the sunny harbour came into sight, one admits to being somewhat flabbergasted. Such a moon! The ritual of invocation demands that the officiant be pure. We have already described the complex operations to be followed in order to call those that sleep in superior dimensions.
The importance placed on ritual sacrifice is constant in religious cult practice.
I do not hide out of fear. My power is immense. Now, I am immobilized. Damned Yankees! My servants will lay you upon the sacrificial stone. My roar will rend the night. You will be mine, and I shall reign once more. Come to me.
The translation will seriously dent what money I have left. I cannot paint. My pictures are clearly the work of a lunatic. He has come back.
The Dark Man wants something else. He seeks a body. His avid servants are now free. I am the cause. It is almost funny.
Okay, this point here is going to be extremely subjective. I would say more so than any other point in this video. Depending on which vibe you believe the game is going for, this aspect is either done brilliantly or pretty poorly. If the goal is to create the more hammy, silly, campy horror like that found in Resident Evil 4, then this voice acting is basically ideal. It perfectly encapsulates the nonsense and over-the-top nature of creeps and ghouls hovering out of floorboards. However, if you believe it is going for the more straight-faced, unnerving, serious horror a la Silent Hill, then unfortunately I do feel like it's falling flat. And honestly, I'm really not sure which one it's actually going for. Like, I can definitely see support for the more campy side, with the creatures rising from the floorboards, the nom worm at the door, the doodly-doo ghosts. But then there's also the parts that make me feel like it's trying to be more serious. The plot point of a man being driven to suicide, the content of the passages I showed, and just the general attempted creation of the mansion's atmosphere as a whole. I don't really mind either one. I love a good depressing horror. I'll never stop running around telling people that Silent Hill 2 is a brilliant examination of guilt, trauma and psychosis. But simultaneously, I'm also up for some campiness. I really liked the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers and It Came From Outer Space. I absolutely loved the first two Scream movies. But this does bring up another point. While Scream is deliberately attempting to spoof horror films, especially the slashers, it does so by upholding many of the features of a more straight-faced horror. So let's take a gander at how Alone in the Dark achieves those.
It was covered in sticky substance.
Come!
Horror games need to make the notion of progressing something that the player kind of doesn't want to do. Not in the way of this pot's too fun, let me never leave you, but in the way of there's probably some horrible shit up ahead. So you'd want to create a sense of trepidation with each step forward. And Sama Umaraku does create that sense in a very specific way, by tapping into its point-and-click roots, particularly by borrowing a feature from one of the big companies of that genre's heyday.
Nomine invocatoris, si non sanctificatus es cave. De vermis mysteriis non absolvo folem legendum fatum et eum versus.
Interacting with certain items can kill you, and while this was annoying in the point-and-click genre, in which the best means to solve a puzzle was clicking everything and then rubbing all of the items together, hoping for a solution, it does actually work well in horror, giving you a feeling of reluctance when moving forward. You start to worry about what will happen if you just mindlessly fiddle with everything, but at the same time, the curiosity will keep you going. And there are actually some clever ways that the game does catch you out, like this one. No, not the creature appearing, that's like Goosebumps level of scares, but the fact that you think you found a weapon to use, but then it fails you in the middle of the battle. So it does a pretty good job of willing you forward, but also promoting caution while you... This game is worse than Gout. But loosely tying into the concept of danger, let's take a gander at something else. This may seem like a very minor point to harp on, but the first encounter in horror can be very important. How the creatures or the supernatural enemies introduce themselves can often set the tone for what kind of horror you're set to encounter, whether it'll be more in your face, more brutal, or more subtle. And Alone in the Dark actually does its first encounter well, managing to walk that fine line between actually catching you off guard, but also not being kind of a tedious generic jump scare. The first creature that you'll most likely come across is the one that jumps through the window in the attic at the start of the game. This will either catch you up by just merely jumping through the window, specifically in a first room of the game, which even nowadays you're still used to being kind of a safe zone to get your bearings, but it can also do it in a secondary way. You can actually see it coming past the window, but you might probably just put it up as a kind of a more part of the ambience, so the fact that it actually does come at you, it does leave a bit of an impact. And again, since this is the first room of the game, it can actually add an extra bit of panic that you still haven't really gotten yourself used to the controls yet. However, unfortunately after the reveal, there is something which kind of does drag down this fear factor. I get that this game is old, but its graphics do unfortunately have a negative impact on the game's attempt to create any kind of horror-like aura. I think particularly the fact that it uses 3D polygons is responsible for this, especially in the modern day. I mean, pixel graphics can still look good to today's eyes. I mean, it is a highly popular style that is still used today. Obviously the versions we have today are much more advanced, but pixel art from the 90s does still look good. Anyway, my main criticism isn't really the graphics in of itself. It's more navigating it to match the vibe of what the type of game is supposed to be portraying. You can quite easily get around poor graphics in a horror game, predominantly character and creature related graphics, due to a pretty straightforward fact. You don't have to fixate on what your evil beings look like. Things aren't scary just because they look ugly. It is because of the threat that they carry to you as a player. Big hulking burly things carry the threat of death, of killing you. Like innocent small looking things create a really uneasy and surreal feeling. So you don't actually need to get a good look at them for them to create the requisite fear. In fact, some would argue not getting a proper look at them can actually amplify the fear. You don't know what this thing is, you don't know what state it possesses. Unfortunately, Alone in the Dark fails with this part. It puts its beasties in full view, allowing an unadulterated look at all four of their polygons. Ironically, for a game called Alone in the Dark, the majority of the rooms are very well lit, and this ties into possibly the most important aspect needed for horror. Alone in the Dark really fails in creating an atmosphere. It attempts to do so. The sounds of the floorboards creaking as you move forward, random occasional noises coming out of nowhere, the occasional piping in of music, but it just doesn't do it very well, unfortunately. With regards to the music, firstly it just isn't really that spooky. Of the two main pieces of music that play while you dot about the mansion, the one sounds more like something you'd play in like Grim Fandango or something. And the other one attempts to be eerie, but just doesn't cut it jack. The most egregious though is probably the combat music. There's nothing wrong with horror games having combat music, obviously, but it kind of does need to fit the tone of the game, and we don't have that here. It sounds like something more from an adventure game. So the music fails in creating the necessary vibe. How does the rest of the sound design do? I would say let's move on to the visual design aspect of the atmosphere, but I do feel like I've kind of touched on that with the graphics already, so I don't know if I should rehash it. You know what, let's do it. I complained that the game is lit up, which it is. It doesn't have any kind of gradient to the rooms. They aren't like dimly lit or have parts where it's darker. It's either completely lit up or completely dark. Now this isn't necessarily a bad thing though. There is a general assumption that horror games always need to be in the dark. A belief which has led to games sometimes actually being obnoxiously dark. And while obviously the limiting of visibility is a pretty straightforward means by which to create unease and uncertainty, it isn't the only way to do it. A lot of Resident Evil 1 actually takes place in well-lit rooms. But it doesn't have the same issue as Alone in the Dark, I'd say for two reasons. Firstly, the rooms are just more interesting and diverse. Helped by the fact that they are more detailed, the rooms in Resident Evil are mostly unique, which has a big impact on making each room something to worry about, something new, something you don't expect. Every room comes with a fear of what's in it because it looks different from one before. Alone in the Dark obviously also has different rooms, but a fair few of them look pretty similar and generic. Even the ones that are like unique to the other ones, they kind of do look like pretty generic examples of how like things look in real life, like a kitchen for example. And this ties into the second factor, size and detail. Resident Evil's rooms tend to be bigger and have more detail. As a result, you don't automatically get a full assessment of the room upon entering. When you enter, you're not fully aware of what's inside, so you still need to move forward with caution. In comparison, Isolated and the Unilluminated generally has smaller rooms, which are less detailed, and so you already have a pretty good idea of the room upon entering, which actually leads the game to relying on creatures coming in later while you're busy in the room or jumping through windows or something like that. I will grant that to a fair extent the limitations of the time, and more notably the temperament we have towards horror nowadays, does impact the atmosphere. Most definitely. But I also don't want to allow it to be an excuse for everything. Ultima Underworld, also released in 1992, and isn't even a horror game, but it creates such a great atmosphere. It is genuinely unnerving as you move forward in that game. Things just creep in from the horizon. You find yourself staring at the void at unease, not really sure what's going to happen if you move forward, what might be around a corner. Similarly, there is horror media from times which would not fit the sensibilities of today, and they are still effective today. So Alone in the Dark's success in checking off my survival horror list creates a pretty mixed bag on the whole. Let's test it against the very last one. This isn't strictly a survival horror issue, but I do think replayability is a harder thing to create in horror, and what I've decided is it's just the genre puzzles than the other, simply because it's based off of surprise and a lack of knowledge. So just playing the game again isn't likely to have as much of an impact. So to combat this, developers usually add extra things for the second playthrough. Silent Hill opens up additional endings and items, Resident Evil has different characters whose plots play differently. Famously, Resident Evil 2 had the first playthrough impacting the second one. Again, I get that Alone in the Dark is probably held back by limitations which prevent it from having too much extra stuff, but it feels like it kind of goes out of its way to be disappointing. It actually gives you the option of choosing your character at the start of the game. I've been talking about Edward Carnby throughout, but you can actually play as Emily Hartwood, the niece of the former owner of the Desoto mansion. She wants to return to the mansion because she believes there's evidence that there's more behind her uncle's death. And while it's nice to have different characters, it is really meaningless here. There's no difference in gameplay, the plot progression is exactly the same, and they don't even have any different capabilities. Now there is many games where you can pick your character and they aren't really that different, but they usually have some kind of reason that might compel one to have a preference for one of the characters, maybe their personality or their design. Alone in the Donkey Kong can't really lay claim to either of these facts. The characters have no personality, apart from their opening monologue. They don't speak or even really react to anything, save for their little victory dance at the end. And I don't think anyone can convincingly argue that they have a preference for their wonderful designs. So it really comes down to a coin toss essentially, and I'm actually a little bit annoyed if I'm honest. I played with Edward first, since he's generally considered to be the face of the franchise, appearing in like all the games, I think all of the games, but after consideration it actually makes more sense to play with Emily. She actually has a link and attachment to the mansion, as opposed to Edward who's just some jumped up antique thief. But as mentioned, it doesn't really matter. Though, actually Alone in the Dark is the best survival horror game, because both characters know how to handle boulders. I was honestly surprised by Alone in the Dark. I had obviously heard about its influence and pioneering in the horror genre, but I was still expecting it to be pretty bad. Quite often with these games, famous for popularizing a certain aspect of gameplay that we know today, either don't do it actually very well and it's really rudimentary, or they do their unique aspect correctly, but that's really all there is to it. And Alone in the Dark certainly has a fair number of issues and limitations, but the ideas that it has are not only for the time interesting, but actually pretty unique today in a way. I mean, we live in the world of the supposed play it your way games, but that usually just leaves you whether you want to kill someone openly or do it silently. And while we do see the environmental kill as a pretty common feature, I feel it's pretty rare to have dedicated puzzles to avoid combat. However, despite it actually being genuinely inventive for its time, and actually being credited as influencing Resident Evil by Shinji Mikami himself, the series quickly dropped in its reception and was rapidly pushed to the back by the games it initially influenced, to the point where its latest installment was so profusely mocked and regularly featured in Worst Games list. Maybe I'll take a look at why this decline happened. Since roughly Resident Evil 7, possibly a bit earlier, we have been in maybe one of the biggest gluts in horror popularity since the PS1 era. Capcom has remade the first 4 Resident Evil games and released Resident Evil Village. Silent Hill is making a return. The first Forbidden Siren has been ported to modern-day PlayStation. Dead Space was remade. The previously Nintendo-only Fatal Frames have been ported to other consoles. Something which I've always found a bit weird, like how Nintendo randomly gets exclusive hold of horror games every now and then. And this is not even considering the vast swathe of indie games that we have in the sphere as well. But despite this, there seems to be very little notice for the point it originated from, punctuated by the fact that there actually is a remake/reboot of Alone in the Dark coming out next year. But I really haven't seen it get that much attention. I mean, the only reason I know it exists is because I was searching the first game on How Long to Beat and saw an entry for Alone in the Dark 2024. And this is something I can very much get behind. I generally don't like remasters and remakes. I feel that if a game is a classic, just port it because classics should always be available, but this time I do feel it's needed. For all the positive ideas the game has, Alone in the Dark is just too frustrating and limited to be a truly fun and enjoyable horror experience in this day and age. Specifically, it's really not getting the horror part right. And even if it's going for the kind of more humorous, hammy kind of horror, I feel like it's too serious to get that done properly. But it does deserve a second chance. With new technology, the new gameplay mechanics we have, let's see if it can place itself back on the pantheon with its spoiled children, or if it will remain alone in the dark. You can help me lift my Lovecraftian curse by liking and subscribing for more content like this.